They had no idea who they were dealing with. When a flight attendant forced a black family out of first class, it seemed like just another act of bias. But moments later, the truth came out. This family wasn't just wealthy, they owned the entire airline. What happened next changed everything. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. The boarding gate buzzed with activity as passengers moved quickly, eager to settle into their seats. Among them was a family of 3. John Anderson, his wife Eliza, and their 5-year-old son Edward. John, dressed in a tailored navy suit, carried a sleek leather briefcase. His demeanor exuded quiet confidence. Eliza, poised and radiant in a flowing ivory dress, held Edward's tiny hand as he skipped beside her, giggling. The family looked forward to their trip, a much-needed break from their hectic lives. As they stepped into the aircraft's first-class cabin, the polished interiors shimmered under the warm cabin lights. John glanced at the seat numbers with a faint smile. "Here we are," he said to Eliza, guiding her and Edward to their seats. Passengers nearby offered brief, polite nods, and the Andersons began settling in. Eliza helped Edward climb into his seat, handing him a small toy airplane that lit up his face with excitement, while John stowed their carry-ons in the overhead compartment. A flight attendant named Evelyn observed the family from across the cabin. Evelyn's sharp gaze swept over them, her lips pressing into a thin line. She adjusted her crisp uniform as if preparing for action and strode briskly toward their seats, her forced smile barely concealing the judgment behind her eyes. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice carrying an edge of authority as she addressed John. "May I see your boarding passes?" John turned to her calmly and retrieved the passes from his jacket pocket. "Of course," he replied with a polite nod, handing them over. Eliza looked up, sensing a hint of tension in Evelyn's tone. Edward, oblivious to the exchange, played happily with his toy. Evelyn examined the tickets with a scrutiny that felt unnecessary. Her eyebrows knitted together as she double-checked the details. "First class?" she questioned, her voice faltering slightly as if the words were hard to believe. John nodded once more, maintaining his calm. "Yes, these are our seats," he replied evenly. His tone was measured, but Eliza caught the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Evelyn hesitated, her discomfort palpable. "I'm sorry, but I need to verify something with the front desk. Please remain seated," she said curtly before turning and walking away, her footsteps quicker now, her movements tense. As Evelyn disappeared behind the curtain, John sat back in his seat, his face unreadable. "What was that about?" Eliza asked softly, her voice laced with concern. John placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Probably a routine check, don't worry about it," he said, though there was a slight tightening around his mouth that suggested otherwise. In the galley, Evelyn was on the phone with a ground staff member, her voice low but urgent. "I have a situation here," she said, glancing back toward the cabin. "There's a family in first class, and I'm not sure their tickets are valid. Could you confirm their booking?" The ground staff member sounded confused. "The Andersons, their tickets were purchased weeks ago, fully confirmed. Is there an issue?" Evelyn paused, struggling to hide her irritation. No issue," she muttered, ending the call abruptly. But instead of returning to the Andersons with an apology, her expression hardened. She adjusted her posture, taking a deep breath before heading back to the first-class cabin. When she approached their seats again, her voice was firmer. "I'm sorry, but I need you to step aside for a moment. There seems to be an error with your booking." Eliza's brows furrowed as she exchanged a glance with John. Edward looked up from his toy, confused by the sudden tension. John rose to his feet, slowly, his calm exterior masking the frustration brewing beneath. "What kind of error?" he asked, his voice steady. "I need to confirm your seating," Evelyn said, avoiding his gaze. She gestured toward the galley. "If you'd follow me, please." John hesitated but nodded, signaling Eliza to stay seated with Edward. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged curious glances, sensing something unusual was unfolding. Eliza watched them go, her unease growing. Edward tugged at her sleeve, sensing the change in atmosphere. "Mommy, what's happening?" he asked softly. She smiled at him, though her grip on his hand tightened slightly. "Nothing, sweetheart," she said gently. "Daddy's just sorting something out." In her heart, she knew this was far from routine. Something wasn't right, and her instincts told her the situation was about to escalate. In the galley, John stood calmly, his presence unshaken, as Evelyn fumbled with her words. "Sir," she began, her voice tinged with an unusual mix of hesitation and authority. "We're trying to clarify a seating issue. It appears that your reservation might have been flagged." John raised an eyebrow, his tone sharp yet controlled. "Flagged? I booked these tickets weeks ago, fully paid and confirmed. What exactly is the issue?" Evelyn crossed her arms, a defensive stance creeping into her posture. "It's not about payment, it's just that first class is a premium cabin, and we have to ensure all seating is accurate." John stared at her for a moment, processing the implication. His lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in disbelief. "Premium cabin?" he repeated. "Are you suggesting that I don't belong here?" Evelyn stiffened, suddenly aware of how her words might have sounded. "Of course not," she replied quickly, her tone sharp as if to mask her discomfort. "I just need to follow protocol." John took a deep breath, his calm exterior betraying a flicker of irritation. "Very well," he said, his voice steady. "Let's resolve this quickly. My family's waiting." Meanwhile, back in the cabin, passengers whispered among themselves. Eliza felt the weight of their stares, but kept her focus on Edward, who was now fidgeting with his toy. A middle-aged man seated across the aisle leaned toward her, his expression sympathetic. "Is everything okay?" he asked in a low voice. Eliza offered him a tight smile. "It's just a mix-up," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. The man nodded but cast a glance toward the galley where John and Evelyn had disappeared, sensing that there was more to the situation than met the eye. As John stood waiting, Evelyn stepped away to speak with another flight attendant, a younger woman named Grace. Grace's brow furrowed as she listened, glancing toward John briefly. "Did you check the reservation system?" Grace asked, her tone cautious. Evelyn frowned. "Yes, but it's not just about the ticket." "Look at him," she whispered, gesturing in John's direction. "Does he seem like the usual first-class passenger?" Grace's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "You can't make those kinds of judgments," she replied firmly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If his ticket is valid, that's the end of it." Evelyn huffed, brushing past Grace to return to John. "Sir," she said, her tone clipped, "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you and your family to move to the main cabin until this is sorted out." John tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight that made Evelyn hesitate. "Like I said, it's protocol," she replied stiffly, avoiding his gaze. John's patience wore thin, his voice lowered, carrying a firmness that made Evelyn flinch. "If you're suggesting we leave first class, I expect a clear and valid reason, because at this moment it seems like you're acting on something other than protocol." Evelyn opened her mouth to respond but was interrupted by a sudden chime over the intercom. The captain's voice filled the cabin, calm yet commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we finalize some adjustments. We'll ensure your comfort for the remainder of the flight." The announcement barely registered with Evelyn, who felt her composure slipping. John gave her a long, pointed look before pulling out his phone. "Excuse me," he said curtly, turning away as he made a call. His tone was measured, but there was no mistaking the authority behind his words. "Is this still the right time?" he asked into the phone. After a brief pause, he added, "Good. Proceed as planned." He ended the call swiftly and returned his attention to Evelyn, his calmness now unsettling. "Shall we return to my family?" John asked, his tone polite but firm. Evelyn hesitated, her confidence shaken. She nodded stiffly and led the way back to the cabin, but something about John's composure made her stomach churn. As they approached the first-class section, all eyes turned toward them. John's return was met with murmurs, passengers clearly sensing the tension in the air. Eliza stood, her gaze meeting John's in silent question. He gave her a reassuring nod, but there was a subtle shift in his expression that only she noticed, a look that told her the situation was far from over. Evelyn remained uneasy as she escorted John back to his seat. Her mind raced, but she maintained her professional facade. Eliza greeted John with a quiet, questioning look, but he gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Edward, sensing his father's return, beamed and resumed playing with his toy airplane, oblivious to the tension simmering around him. Before John could fully settle in, Evelyn returned, her face set in determination. "Sir," she began, her voice clipped, "we've decided that it would be best for you and your family to move to the main cabin until we can fully verify your reservation." Eliza's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. glancing at John to gauge his reaction. John took a slow, deliberate breath and looked directly at Evelyn, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Our tickets have been verified. We paid for these seats in full. If there's a valid reason for us to move, I'd like to hear it now." Evelyn hesitated, her confidence faltering under John's unyielding gaze. Other passengers began to take notice, their murmurs growing louder. An elderly woman a few rows away whispered to her companion, "They've been perfectly polite. What's the issue?" A younger man seated nearby interjected loudly enough for others to hear, "They're paying customers, like the rest of us. Why are they being singled out?" The rising voices seemed to rattle Evelyn further. "Sir, I don't want to escalate this," she said, her tone sharpening. "Please cooperate, or I'll be forced to involve security." Eliza's eyes narrowed, her patience clearly wearing thin. Before she could speak, John raised a hand gently, signaling for her to stay calm. He stood slowly, adjusting his suit jacket with deliberate precision. "If you're calling security," he said evenly, "make sure they come prepared with an explanation." The challenge in his tone sent a ripple through the cabin. Evelyn's face paled slightly, but she held her ground. "Please gather your belongings," she insisted, her voice now betraying a hint of desperation. John locked eyes with her for a long moment before turning to Eliza. "It's fine," he said softly, his calm demeanor as steady as ever. "Let's go." Passengers watched in silence as John, Eliza, and Edward stood to collect their things. Edward clung to his toy airplane, his earlier excitement now dimmed by confusion. Eliza kept her head high, her expression unreadable as she held Edward's hand. John led the way toward the main cabin, his steps measured and deliberate, even as the weight of countless eyes bore down on them. As they walked, John reached into his pocket and sent a quick message on his phone, his face betraying nothing. They were directed to cramped seats in the middle row of the main cabin. John helped Eliza settle Edward into his new seat before sitting beside them. The contrast between the space and luxury of first class and the tight confines of the main cabin was stark, but neither John nor Eliza showed any outward reaction. Meanwhile, Evelyn returned to the galley, her nerves fraying as she overheard the murmurs from first-class passengers. "That wasn't right," one man muttered. "They had tickets, why treat them like that?" another added. "This is going to backfire." Evelyn ignored the comments, but her discomfort grew. As she reached the galley phone, it buzzed, startling her. She picked it up hesitantly, her voice shaky. "This is Evelyn," she said. The captain's voice came through, firm and no nonsense. "Miss Summers, I just received a call from the airline's executive team. They've been contacted directly by a passenger on this flight. I need to know exactly what's going on." Evelyn's stomach dropped. She stumbled over her words, her confidence evaporating. It was just a routine issue," she stammered. "I thought there might have been a mistake with their tickets." There was a long pause on the other end, and when the captain spoke again, his tone carried a warning. "You need to handle this carefully. We cannot afford a situation like this. I suggest you tread lightly until further notice." Evelyn hung up the phone, her palms sweaty. She glanced toward the main cabin where John sat with his family, his expression calm, but with a quiet intensity that made her stomach churn. For the first time, she felt the weight of her decisions bearing down on her, and the growing sense that she had underestimated who she was dealing with. John sat in the main cabin, his posture straight and composed, as if the downgrade to a cramped seat hadn't fazed him. Eliza sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on Edward's shoulder as he played with his toy airplane. Though outwardly calm, her sharp glances toward the first-class cabin betrayed her simmering frustration. John, however, seemed unbothered. He pulled out his phone, typed a brief message, and then leaned back, observing the situation with a quiet air of control. Back in the first-class cabin, the passengers' murmurs had grown louder. A tall man in a tailored suit leaned toward Evelyn as she walked past. "That family had valid tickets," he said, his tone critical. "What exactly was the problem?" Evelyn tried to keep her voice firm, though her nerves were clearly frayed. "It's just a procedural matter. Everything's under control." The man frowned but didn't press further, though his disapproval was evident. Evelyn hurried back to the galley where her colleague Grace was organizing refreshments. Grace shot her a disapproving glance as she handed over a tray of drinks. "You need to fix this," Grace said in a low voice. "That man isn't just any passenger. He's been calm, but I can tell he's not letting this slide." Evelyn bristled. "I was just following protocol. It's not my fault if people can't handle being questioned." Grace set the tray down with more force than necessary, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Protocol doesn't mean you single people out based on assumptions, and now you've turned the entire cabin against you." Evelyn opened her mouth to retort, but stopped when the galley phone buzzed again. Her stomach twisted as she picked it up. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't the captain's. It was the airline's executive office. "Miss Summers," a calm but firm voice said, "we've received a direct complaint from a passenger on your flight. It's regarding the handling of a seating issue in first class." Evelyn's breath caught. "I was just following," the voice cut her off sharply. "Save your explanations. You've removed a family with fully confirmed first-class tickets. The passenger in question is John Anderson. I suggest you look up his name in the system immediately." Evelyn's hand trembled as she ended the call. She turned to the nearby service computer, her fingers fumbling over the keyboard. When John Anderson's profile appeared on the screen, her heart sank. Beside his name was a special designation: Executive Level Primary Shareholder. Evelyn's mouth went dry. This wasn't just any passenger. John Anderson wasn't simply wealthy. He was one of the airline's owners. Back in the main cabin, John watched as Evelyn emerged from the galley, her face pale and her steps less confident. She approached their row hesitantly, her usual air of authority conspicuously absent. "Mr. Anderson," she began, her voice low and uneven, "I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience. It seems there was an error on my part." John turned to her slowly, his expression calm but unreadable. "An error?" he repeated, his tone neutral. "You removed my family from first class based on what, exactly?" Evelyn swallowed hard, her words faltering. I made a mistake in verifying your reservation. I assure you it won't happen again." Eliza looked at Evelyn sharply, her composure cracking. "You embarrassed my family in front of an entire cabin. You made assumptions about us without any cause. Do you really think an apology is enough?" Edward looked up at his mother, sensing her anger, and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. John placed a calming hand on her arm. "Eliza," he said softly, his voice steady, "let's not escalate this here." He turned back to Evelyn, his gaze piercing. "I'll handle this matter directly with your superiors," he said, his tone controlled but firm. "For now, we'll remain where we are." Evelyn nodded stiffly. Unsure how to respond, she retreated back to the galley, her steps quick and unsteady. The full weight of her mistake was sinking in, but she still didn't grasp how far-reaching the consequences would be. John leaned back in his seat, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. He had made his move, and now it was only a matter of time. Evelyn returned to the galley, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter for support. The realization of who John Anderson truly was left her reeling. She replayed every interaction with the family, each one now a glaring indictment of her actions. She glanced nervously at Grace, who was watching her with a mix of disappointment and pity. "Did you know?" Evelyn whispered, her voice shaky. Grace sighed, shaking her head. "No, but it doesn't matter. You treated them unfairly, and now it looks like you're going to answer for it." Evelyn's stomach churned. Before she could respond, the galley phone buzzed once more. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the receiver before finally picking it up. The captain's voice was tense. "Miss Summers," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I've just received another call from the executive office. Mr. Anderson's identity has been confirmed, and they're not happy. The instructions are clear. He and his family are to be reinstated in first class immediately, and you are to personally deliver an apology." Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. "Understood," she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper. When the line went dead, she leaned against the counter, her heart racing. Grace crossed her arms, her gaze unrelenting. "You brought this on yourself. Do the right thing before it gets worse." Summoning what little courage she had left, Evelyn prepared herself. She adjusted her uniform and walked back toward the main cabin. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. As she approached the Anderson family, passengers turned to watch, their curiosity palpable. "Mr. Anderson?" Evelyn began again, her voice softer than anyone had heard it before. "On behalf of the airline? I'd like to sincerely apologize for the inconvenience and the way your family has been treated. It was an error in judgment, and I take full responsibility." Eliza raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Now you realize it's an error?" she asked, her voice cold. Evelyn's face flushed, but she kept her tone professional. "The executive office has instructed that your family be returned to first class immediately. I will personally ensure that your seats are ready and that no further disruptions occur." John looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small nod, he stood and gestured for Eliza and Edward to follow. Eliza held Edward's hand tightly as they walked past Evelyn, her back straight and her gaze forward. Edward, still unaware of the gravity of the situation, clutched his toy airplane as he skipped slightly beside his mother. When they reached first class, Evelyn busied herself preparing their seats, ensuring every detail was perfect. He placed sparkling water on the tray tables and adjusted the pillows with trembling hands. John, Eliza, and Edward settled in, their demeanor calm but distant. As Evelyn stepped back, she offered a final apology. "If there's anything else you need, please let me know." John nodded lightly, his tone polite but firm. "We'll let you know." Evelyn retreated to the galley, her face pale and her nerves frayed. She had followed the captain's orders, but the damage was already done. The murmurs in first class had subsided, but the disapproving looks from the passengers lingered. Grace, standing quietly in the galley, shook her head as Evelyn returned. "It's not over," Grace said quietly. "You know that, right?" Evelyn didn't respond. She knew Grace was right. John's calm demeanor wasn't one of forgiveness. It was the calm of someone who had already set the wheels of accountability in motion. And for the first time, Evelyn understood that the repercussions of her actions were only just beginning. As the flight settled back into a semblance of normality, Evelyn tried to focus on her remaining duties, but her mind was clouded with anxiety. Every glance from the passengers felt like a silent judgment, every interaction a reminder of her earlier mistake. She glanced toward the first-class cabin where John and his family sat. They seemed composed, yet their presence weighed on her heavily. John, however, was far from passive. Sitting upright in his seat, he tapped methodically on his phone, his movements deliberate. Beside him, Eliza leaned back, her expression unreadable, while Edward happily sipped juice from a small carton. The serene picture they painted only added to the growing unease in the cabin. Evelyn wasn't the only one feeling the tension. Grace, quietly observing, had overheard murmurs among the first-class passengers. "Do you think they'll file a formal complaint?" one man whispered to his companion. Another passenger responded, "If it were me, I'd take it straight to the top." In the galley, the phone buzzed once again. Evelyn froze, the sound now synonymous with dread. She picked it up hesitantly, her voice shaking. "This is Evelyn." The captain's voice was sharper this time. "Ms. Summers, I've just received another update from the executive office. Mr. Anderson's legal team is monitoring the situation closely. They've requested a full account of events, and they'll be waiting upon landing. I suggest you prepare yourself." Evelyn's grip tightened on the receiver. "Yes, Captain," she replied weakly before hanging up. The message was clear. John Anderson wasn't letting the incident fade into the background. Back in first class, John finished typing another message and leaned back, finally setting his phone down. Eliza glanced at him curiously. "You've been quiet," she said softly, her tone filled with understanding. John looked at her, his expression calm but resolute. "This isn't just about us," he replied. "This is about accountability. People like her need to understand that actions have consequences." Eliza nodded, her gaze softening. She knew her husband's approach, measured, deliberate, and effective. It was what had propelled him to where he was today, a man of influence who never tolerated injustice, no matter how small. Meanwhile, Evelyn paced in the galley, her nerves unraveling. Grace approached her cautiously. "What's the plan now?" Grace asked. Evelyn shook her head, her voice barely audible. "I don't know. I never thought something like this would spiral so far." Grace's expression hardened. "You should have thought about that before treating them the way you did. Now it's out of your hands." Evelyn glared at her but said nothing, the truth of Grace's words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. The remainder of the flight dragged on, the hum of the engines doing little to mask the tension. Passengers in first class occasionally glanced toward John and his family, their expressions a mix of curiosity and respect. Others simply pretended not to notice, though their whispered conversations betrayed their interest. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." John adjusted his seat and leaned toward Eliza. "This will be over soon," he said quietly. She gave him a small, supportive smile, her hand resting briefly on his. In the galley, Evelyn stared at the clock, her chest tightening with every passing minute. She knew the landing would bring no relief, only more questions, more judgment, and likely more consequences. Grace's warning echoed in her mind. It's not over, and Evelyn knew, deep down, that the worst was yet to come. The plane touched down smoothly, the familiar jolt signaling the end of the flight. For most passengers, it was the start of a routine disembarkation. For Evelyn, it felt like the beginning of her reckoning. She stood stiffly near the galley, her hands gripping the counter as passengers began collecting their belongings. Her eyes flicked toward first class, where John Anderson remained seated, calm and unhurried. Eliza leaned toward John as Edward sat quietly, swinging his legs. "What's the plan?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the sounds of passengers preparing to leave. John's expression didn't change. "We wait," he replied simply. "Everything is already in motion." As the first-class passengers began filing out, many cast curious glances at John and his family. One man stopped briefly by John's seat, hesitating before speaking. "I'm sorry for what happened earlier," he said, his voice low but earnest. "It wasn't right." John looked up at him, offering a small nod. "Thank you," he replied. The man nodded back and continued toward the exit, his expression thoughtful. Evelyn stood near the plane's main door, forcing herself to smile at departing passengers. Each polite nod and murmured farewell felt heavier than the last. She couldn't help but glance back at first class, where John and his family remained seated. Their refusal to join the crowd of disembarking passengers made her stomach churn. The galley phone buzzed, and Evelyn jumped, startled. She grabbed it quickly, her voice cracking as she answered. "This is Evelyn." It was the captain again, his tone clipped. "Security will be waiting at the gate. They've been briefed by the executive team. You're to stay on board and provide a full account of your actions. Do not leave the plane until instructed." Evelyn's heart sank. "Understood," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she hung up. Grace approached her, her expression grim. "They're here, aren't they?" Grace asked. Evelyn nodded numbly. "Security, the executives, probably the board," Grace sighed, shaking her head. "Told you this wasn't over." As the last few passengers left the plane, the cabin grew eerily quiet. Evelyn turned to see John rise from his seat, smoothing his jacket as he helped Eliza gather their belongings. Edward clutched his toy airplane tightly, looking up at his parents with a curious expression. Evelyn stepped forward hesitantly, her voice shaking. "Mr. Anderson, I want to apologize again for—" John raised a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. His tone was calm but final. "Save it. The people waiting outside will hear everything you have to say." Eliza shot Evelyn a cold glance as she took Edward's hand and stepped into the aisle. John followed behind them, his presence commanding without effort. As the family approached the plane's exit, 2 uniformed security officers stepped aboard. They exchanged brief nods with John before their eyes landed on Evelyn. "Miss Summers?" one officer asked, his tone firm. Evelyn's throat tightened. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll need you to remain on the plane for questioning," the officer said. "Please follow us to the galley." John paused briefly at the door, turning back to look at Evelyn. His expression remained calm, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that sent a chill through her. Without another word, he stepped off the plane, his family following closely behind. As they disappeared into the terminal, Evelyn felt the full weight of her actions pressing down on her. The officers gestured for her to move toward the galley, and she obeyed, her legs trembling. The realization hit her with brutal clarity. Her future was no longer in her hands. As the Anderson family stepped into the terminal, the atmosphere shifted around them. The usual bustle of passengers was interrupted by the sight of 2 executives, in tailored suits, waiting nearby. They stood stiffly, their professional demeanor masking their nervous energy. One of them, a tall man with silver-rimmed glasses, stepped forward to greet John. "Mr. Anderson," the man began, his tone apologetic but formal. "I'm Victor Hale, Vice President of Operations. On behalf of the airline, I want to extend our deepest apologies for the unacceptable treatment you and your family experienced today. We are taking this matter very seriously." John nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. Eliza stood beside him, holding Edward's hand, her posture as composed as ever. "I trust you are," John replied. his tone calm but cutting. "This isn't just about us. It's about the standards your airline claims to uphold and how they've failed today." Victor swallowed visibly, adjusting his tie. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Anderson. We are already initiating a thorough review of our policies and training programs to ensure that nothing like this happens again. I assure you, accountability will be taken." John tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Accountability," he repeated. "That's exactly what I expect. I also expect to see tangible changes, not just promises. Words won't repair the damage caused by actions or assumptions." Victor nodded quickly. "We've already begun the process of reviewing the incident. The flight attendant involved will be questioned and held responsible for her actions. If you have time, the CEO himself would like to meet with you to discuss this further." John glanced at Eliza, who gave a subtle nod of agreement. "Schedule the meeting," John said. "I'll make time." As the Andersons walked toward the baggage claim, the executives lingered, exchanging uneasy glances. Back on the plane, Evelyn sat in the galley, flanked by the two security officers. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the table in front of her. The air felt heavy and the silence was oppressive. One of the officers broke the silence. "Miss Summers, we're going to need a detailed statement about the events on this flight. The airline's executive team is already reviewing the complaint filed by Mr. Anderson." Evelyn's eyes darted between the two officers. I didn't know who he was," she stammered. I thought there was an issue with their tickets." One of the officers frowned, his gaze steady. "Miss Summers, the issue wasn't with their tickets. The issue was with your actions. What made you decide to remove a family with confirmed first-class reservations?" Evelyn hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find the right words. Her voice came out weak and defensive. "I was following protocol. I thought they might have been in the wrong section. First class it's premium seating, and they—" She stopped herself, realizing how her words sounded. The officer's expression hardened. "And they what, Miss Summers? Didn't look the part?" Evelyn's face flushed. "No, I didn't mean that. I made a mistake. I didn't intend for this to happen." The second officer leaned forward, his voice sharper. "Intentions don't matter here. What matters are your actions, and those actions have consequences. Do you understand the severity of this situation?" Evelyn nodded quickly, her throat dry. She felt cornered, every word she said seeming to dig her deeper into trouble. "I didn't mean to cause any harm," she said, her voice trembling. "I was just trying to do my job." The first officer exchanged a glance with his colleague before speaking again. "Your job is to ensure that passengers are treated with respect and dignity. What happened here today was the opposite of that." As Evelyn sat in stunned silence, the weight of their words settled over her. For the first time, she began to fully grasp the gravity of her actions, not just for her own career, but for the harm she had caused to the Anderson family. Her stomach churned as she thought of John's calm, piercing gaze and Eliza's quiet but powerful presence. She had underestimated them, and now she was facing the fallout. Meanwhile, in the terminal, the Andersons arrived at the baggage claim. Edward, holding tightly to his toy airplane, watched the conveyor belt with excitement. John and Eliza stood quietly, their calm exterior masking the whirlwind of emotions beneath the surface. "Do you think they'll actually do anything?" Eliza asked, her voice low. John glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. "They'll have no choice," he replied. "The airline's reputation is at stake now. If they don't act, this will become a much bigger problem for them." As the conveyor belt began moving, John's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, reading the notification. It was a message from his legal team, confirming that the incident had already been escalated to the airline's board of directors. John's lips curled into a faint smile as he put the phone away. "They'll act," he said simply, his tone carrying a quiet confidence. "And if they don't, I'll make sure they regret it." The family collected their luggage and moved toward the exit, their steps steady and purposeful. Behind them, whispers from passengers who had witnessed the earlier incident filled the air. Some expressed sympathy, others outrage. But one thing was clear: the events of this flight wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. For John, the day wasn't over yet. There were meetings to attend, decisions to make, and changes to enforce. As he stepped into the waiting car outside the terminal, he glanced back at the airport one last time. The storm he had set in motion was only beginning. The drive away from the airport was quiet, but the weight of the day hung heavily in the air. John stared out the car window, his fingers drumming lightly on the leather seat. Eliza sat beside him, her hand resting on Edward's lap as the boy dozed off, his toy airplane still clutched in his small hands. The hum of the car engine was the only sound, but John's mind was far from at rest. "We can't let this go, John," Eliza finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but carried an edge of determination. "This wasn't just an insult to us. It's a reflection of something bigger. If this can happen to us, imagine how often it happens to people without the means to fight back." John nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the passing cityscape. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I've already set the wheels in motion. This isn't just about today, it's about setting a precedent." Eliza leaned back, her expression softening. She trusted John's methodical nature, his ability to turn personal affronts into broader change, but part of her still simmered with anger at the humiliation they'd endured. "It wasn't just her," she added, her tone sharpening. "It was the entire system that made her think she could act that way." John turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "That's exactly what we're going to address," he said firmly. As the car pulled into the driveway of their home, Edward stirred, rubbing his eyes and yawning. Eliza scooped him up, carrying him inside while John lingered in the car for a moment. He pulled out his phone and reviewed the messages from his legal team. There was already confirmation that the airline's board had been notified of the incident, along with an official statement from their public relations team expressing regret and promising immediate action. But John wasn't interested in hollow words or surface-level damage control. He composed a quick email addressed to the airline's CEO and copied to the board of directors. The tone was professional but unyielding. "The treatment my family and I experienced on Flight 237 today was unacceptable and reflective of deeper issues within your company. This is not about a single employee's behavior. It's about the culture that allowed such behavior to occur. As a primary shareholder, I am requesting a full investigation into this incident and a detailed plan for corrective action. This includes the implementation of mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees, the establishment of stronger accountability measures, and a public commitment to ensuring respect and fairness for every passenger. I will expect a formal response within 48 hours outlining your proposed steps. Please understand that this is not a request, it is an expectation." After hitting send, John stepped out of the car, his mind focused on what lay ahead. Inside the house, Eliza was tucking Edward into bed. When she rejoined John in the living room, she found him seated at his desk, already reviewing documents on his laptop. "Do you think they'll listen?" she asked, sitting across from him. "They'll have no choice," John replied, not looking up. "This isn't just a PR issue for them, it's a liability, and I intend to make sure they understand that." Meanwhile, back at the airport, Evelyn sat in a stark conference room, her nerves frayed and her thoughts racing. She had been escorted there after the security officers finished their initial questioning. Now she waited for the airline's internal review team to arrive. The room was cold and quiet, save for the ticking of a clock on the wall. When the door finally opened, 3 individuals entered: a man in a gray suit, a woman with sharp features and a clipboard, and a younger man who carried a laptop. They took their seats across from Evelyn, their expressions neutral but their presence imposing. "Miss Summers," the woman began, her tone brisk. "We've been tasked with conducting a preliminary review of the incident that occurred on Flight 237. This is not a formal hearing, but we will be documenting your account in detail. Do you understand?" Evelyn nodded stiffly, her voice caught in her throat. "Yes?" The man in the gray suit adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Let's begin with a basic question. What made you decide to remove Mr. Anderson and his family from their first-class seats?" Evelyn hesitated, her mind scrambling for the right words. I thought there was a mistake," she said weakly. "I thought their tickets might not have been valid." The younger man typed something into his laptop, the sound of the keys echoing in the silent room. The woman with the clipboard raised an eyebrow. "You thought," she repeated. "Based on what exactly?" Evelyn's face flushed. They didn't look like first-class passengers," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The woman with the clipboard exchanged a glance with her colleagues before speaking again. "Miss Summers, do you understand how problematic that statement is? First-class passengers are not defined by appearance." Evelyn nodded quickly, her palms sweaty. "I realize that now," she said, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake. I was just trying to do my job." The man in the gray suit leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Your job," he said slowly, "is to uphold the airline's policies and ensure a positive experience for all passengers. Today you failed to do that in a way that has significant implications, not just for you, but for the entire company." Evelyn stared down at her hands, the enormity of her mistake sinking in. She had thought she was exercising authority, but instead, she had exposed the cracks in her judgment, and now she was facing the consequences. The review team continued questioning her for what felt like hours, dissecting every decision she had made during the flight. By the time the session ended, Evelyn felt hollow, as if the life had been drained from her. She knew her future with the airline was hanging by a thread, and she wasn't sure how much longer it would hold. As she was escorted out of the room, she caught a glimpse of a large screen displaying news headlines. One caught her eye, making her stomach drop. "Primary airline shareholder demands reform after discriminatory incident on board." Evelyn's heart sank further. It was clear this was only the beginning of the fallout. The news of the incident spread like wildfire. By the time the Anderson family arrived home, headlines were already flooding social media and news outlets. Titles ranged from "Airline in hot water after mistreatment of shareholder's family" to "Discrimination on board, family forced to move despite first-class tickets." Each article painted a damning picture of the airline's policies, or lack thereof. John sat in his home office, scrolling through the coverage. The response was overwhelming. Public sentiment leaned heavily in his favor, with users on social media expressing outrage and sharing their own stories of bias and unfair treatment. Many tagged the airline directly, demanding answers and accountability. John's phone buzzed non-stop with calls and messages, but he ignored most of them, focusing instead on preparing for his meeting with the airline's CEO the following day. In the living room, Eliza watched a news segment that featured a panel discussion about the incident. "This isn't just about a family being moved from their seats," one commentator argued. "This is about the systemic biases that persist in customer-facing industries. The fact that this family had to endure such humiliation despite having valid tickets highlights a deeper issue." Eliza muted the television, her expression thoughtful. She turned to Edward, who was happily building a tower with his blocks, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around them. She envied his innocence, but felt even more determined to protect it. The ordeal had shaken her, but it had also reminded her why they couldn't let this go. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, the executive team was in crisis mode. The CEO, William Langston, stood at the head of a conference room table, his expression grim. Around him, senior executives pored over reports, media coverage, and social media analytics. The situation was spiraling out of control, and every passing hour brought more bad press. "This is a disaster," one executive muttered, flipping through a stack of papers. "We've had PR issues before, but this is different. This involves one of our primary shareholders. If we don't handle this carefully, we could lose him, and worse, our reputation." William held up a hand, silencing the room. "What's the status on the internal review?" he asked, his tone clipped. A senior HR manager cleared her throat. "We've completed the preliminary questioning with the flight attendant involved. Her actions were clearly based on bias, though she claims it wasn't intentional. She's been suspended pending further investigation." William frowned, his jaw tightening. "Suspended? That's not enough. We're dealing with a shareholder who has direct access to our board. We need to show decisive action." Another executive chimed in cautiously. "We're preparing an official apology and outlining new training initiatives. We've already reached out to Mr. Anderson's team to schedule a meeting." William nodded, but his expression remained tense. "Good, but it won't be enough to placate him. He's not just angry. He's a man who understands leverage. He's going to push for systemic change, and we have to be ready to deliver." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. They all understood the stakes. This wasn't just about resolving one incident. It was about addressing a culture that had allowed such an incident to occur in the first place. Back at her apartment, Evelyn sat on her couch, staring blankly at the termination notice on her laptop screen. The message from HR had been brief and cold. "Your actions during Flight 237 were deemed a violation of our company's core values and customer service policies. Your employment with the airline has been terminated effective immediately." Her hands trembled as she reread the email, the words blurring together. In the span of a single day, her career had unraveled. The job she had prided herself on for years was gone, and she had no one to blame but herself. Evelyn's phone buzzed with notifications, texts from friends and family who had seen the news. Most messages were sympathetic, but a few were bluntly critical. She didn't respond to any of them. The shame was too heavy, and she wasn't ready to face the full extent of her failure. She turned on the television, hoping for a distraction, but instead she was confronted with a news anchor discussing the incident. The words stung. The airline's handling of this situation has sparked outrage, particularly given the clear racial undertones of the flight attendant's actions. This is a stark reminder that unconscious bias can have real, damaging consequences. Evelyn switched off the TV, burying her face in her hands. She had thought her actions were harmless, that she was just following protocol. But now the truth was glaringly obvious. Her biases had blinded her, and her snap judgment had caused harm not only to the Andersons, but to the reputation of the company she once loved. For the first time, Evelyn felt the full weight of what she had done, not just the loss of her job, but the damage she had caused to others. She picked up her laptop, hesitating for a moment before typing an email. The recipient was the Anderson family. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Anderson," she began, "I am writing to apologize sincerely for my actions on Flight 237. I now realize how my biases influenced my decisions, and I deeply regret the hurt and humiliation I caused your family. My actions were inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for them." She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she wanted to express her regret. After finishing the email, she hit send and sat back, staring at the screen. It was a small step, but it was all she could do. As night fell, John sat in his study, reviewing a draft of the airline's proposed plan for reform. It was thorough, outlining mandatory training programs, new accountability measures, and a commitment to fostering a more inclusive culture. While it was a step in the right direction, John knew it would take more than words to enact real change. Eliza entered the room holding a cup of tea. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked, gesturing to the documents on his desk. John looked up, his expression thoughtful. "It's a start," he said, "but it's not enough. Not yet." He set the papers aside and took the tea from her, his gaze softening. "This isn't just about punishing one person. It's about ensuring no one else has to go through what we did." Eliza nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then let's make sure they follow through." John smiled faintly, the determination in his eyes unwavering. The fight wasn't over, but neither was his resolve. The next morning, John arrived at the airline's headquarters for his scheduled meeting with William Langston, the CEO. The building was sleek and modern, towering above the bustling city streets. A professional-looking assistant greeted John in the lobby, her demeanor respectful but visibly nervous. "Mr. Anderson," she said with a slight bow of her head. "Mr. Langston is expecting you, right this way." John followed her through the polished corridors, his footsteps measured and deliberate. Employees they passed exchanged furtive glances, aware of who he was and why he was there. When they reached the executive conference room, the assistant opened the door and gestured for him to enter. William Langston stood to greet John, extending a hand. "Mr. Anderson, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. We deeply regret the circumstances that brought us here." John accepted the handshake, his expression calm but firm. "Let's get straight to it," he replied, taking a seat. "Regret is only meaningful if it's followed by action." William nodded, his face tightening. "I completely agree. Allow me to walk you through the steps we've already taken." He gestured to a large screen on the wall which displayed a detailed presentation. "Our response includes several immediate measures," William began. "First, the flight attendant involved has been terminated. We've also launched mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees, starting with customer-facing roles. Additionally, we're implementing a stricter accountability framework to address and prevent incidents like this in the future." John listened without interrupting, his eyes scanning the slides on the screen. The proposed changes were comprehensive, but he wasn't ready to accept them at face value. When William finished, John leaned forward, his hands clasped. "This is a step in the right direction," John said. "But let's not pretend that firing one person and announcing training programs will fix the underlying issues. This isn't just about one incident. It's about the culture of your organization. That takes more than policy updates. It takes consistent, measurable change." William looked uneasy, but nodded. "You're absolutely right. We're committed to ensuring this goes beyond surface-level adjustments. John tapped the table lightly, his tone steady. I want monthly progress reports on the implementation of these changes. I want to see data, employee feedback, incident trends, and measurable improvements. And I want an independent review conducted by a third party, not your internal team. William hesitated for a moment, then nodded again. We can arrange that. Anything else? John's gaze hardened slightly. Yes. I also want a public apology, not just to my family, but to every passenger who has experienced discrimination while flying with your airline. This isn't just about me. It's about setting an example. William's expression tightened, but he didn't argue. Understood. We'll issue a formal statement today. John sat back, his demeanor calm but commanding. Good. I'll be watching closely, Mr. Langston. Langston. Don't mistake my cooperation for complacency. The tension in the room was palpable as William nodded once more. We won't disappoint you, he said quietly. As John left the headquarters, his phone buzzed with notifications. Social media was still abuzz with discussions about the incident, with hashtags like airline accountability and bias in flight trending globally. John scrolled through the posts briefly, noting the widespread support, but also the calls for deeper systemic change. This wasn't just about his family anymore. It had become a flashpoint for a larger conversation. Back at home, Eliza was seated at the kitchen table, her laptop open as she read an email from the airline's PR team. The message outlined their planned public statement, which included an apology and a commitment to addressing the issues raised by the incident. Eliza forwarded the email to John with a simple note. What do you think? John read it as he entered the house, setting his bag down. He replied with a single word. Adequate. Eliza looked up as he entered the kitchen, a knowing smile on her face. Adequate? She teased lightly. That's high praise from you. John chuckled, leaning against the counter. It's a start, he said, but there's still a long way to go. Eliza nodded, her expression thoughtful. Do you think they'll follow through, or is this just damage control? John's eyes narrowed slightly. If they don't follow through, I'll make sure they wish they had. At the airline, the ripple effects of the incident were already being felt. Employees gathered in break rooms and hallways, whispering about the changes that were coming. Some were relieved, welcoming the focus on bias and accountability. Others were skeptical, doubting that a company so large could change its culture so quickly. Evelyn, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Her termination had been the subject of quiet conversations among her former colleagues, many of whom expressed shock at how quickly the situation had escalated. But for those who had witnessed her actions firsthand, the consensus was clear. She had crossed a line, and the consequences were unavoidable. Grace, who had worked closely with Evelyn on the flight, reflected on the ordeal as she prepared for her shift. She had always known that the airline's culture had its flaws, but seeing them so blatantly exposed had been a wake-up call. She vowed to approach her own work differently, ensuring that no passenger ever felt the way the Andersons had been made to feel. That evening, as John and Eliza prepared for bed, Edward peeked into their room, his toy airplane clutched in his hand. Mommy, Daddy? He asked, his voice small. Are people still mad about what happened on the plane? John knelt down, pulling Edward into a gentle hug. Some people are upset, buddy, he said softly, but it's because they want things to get better, and we're helping them do that. Edward nodded, his eyes wide. Are you going to fix it? John smiled, ruffling his son's hair. That's the plan. As Edward returned to his room, Eliza looked at John, her expression a mix of pride and determination. We are going to fix it, she said quietly. Not just for us, but for everyone. John nodded, his resolve unwavering. This isn't the end, he replied. It's just the beginning. The following morning, news outlets buzzed with the airline's public statement, which had gone live overnight. The apology was thorough and direct, acknowledging the incident involving the Anderson family and outlining immediate steps being taken to address the broader issues. The statement read in part, We deeply regret the incident that occurred on Flight 237 involving Mr. Anderson and his family. This event does not reflect our values, and we are committed to taking meaningful action to prevent such situations in the future. Effective immediately, we are implementing mandatory training programs, strengthening our policies, and conducting a third-party review of our organizational practices to ensure equity and respect for all passengers. The statement ended with a direct apology to the Anderson family, recognizing John's role as a shareholder and, more importantly, as a valued customer who deserved better. Social media exploded with reactions. While some commended the airline for owning up to its mistakes, others were skeptical, accusing the company of damage control. The hashtags accountability matters and fly fair continued to trend, fueling debates about systemic biases in customer service industries. John read the statement while sitting at the breakfast table, his expression thoughtful. Eliza, seated across from him with a cup of coffee, watched him closely. "Well?" she asked. "It's a solid first step," John said, setting his phone down. "But now they'll have to prove they mean it." Eliza nodded, her expression serious. "And what about Evelyn? Do you think she learned anything from all of this?" John paused, considering the question. "That's not up to me," he said finally. "But I hope she did. People like her are part of the problem, but they can also be part of the solution, if they're willing to change." Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in her small apartment, scrolling through the same news coverage. The public apology from the airline had done little to ease her sense of guilt. If anything, it deepened it. Every headline, every comment about the incident felt like a personal indictment. She opened her email inbox, rereading the message she had sent to the Anderson family the night before. There had been no response yet, but she hadn't expected one. She wasn't sure she deserved forgiveness, but sending the apology had felt necessary, a small step toward taking responsibility. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Grace. "I heard about your termination. I hope you're doing okay. This whole thing has been a mess, but maybe it's a chance to start fresh." Evelyn stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "Thanks, Grace. I'm trying. I have a lot to think about." Grace's reply came quickly. "If you ever want to talk, let me know. We've all made mistakes. It's how we learn from them that matters." Evelyn set the phone down, her mind racing. Grace's words stuck with her. "It's how we learn from them that matters." She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but she knew she couldn't go back to who she had been before. Change had to start somewhere, and it had to start with her. At the airline's headquarters, William Langston stood in front of the board of directors, presenting the company's plan for reform. John sat at the end of the table, his presence commanding, even in silence. The room was tense as William outlined the changes being implemented, from the new training programs to the independent reviews. When William finished, he turned to John. "Mr. Anderson, we're confident that these measures will address the issues you've raised. We value your feedback and your commitment to holding us accountable." John leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "This is a good start," he said, "but it's just that, a start. I'll be watching closely to ensure these changes are more than just promises on paper." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to argue. John's influence was clear, and his resolve left little room for doubt. As the meeting adjourned, one of the board members approached John. She was an older woman with a kind but serious expression. "Mr. Anderson," she said, "I want you to know that some of us on the board are fully behind you. This is the kind of accountability our airline has needed for a long time." John nodded, offering a small smile. "I appreciate that," he said. "Now let's make sure it happens." Later that day, as John returned home, he found Eliza in the backyard, watching Edward play with a toy plane. The boy ran around laughing as he mimicked the sound of an engine. John stood beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Meeting went well?" he said simply. Eliza smiled. "I'm glad. Did you give them the usual no excuses talk?" John chuckled. "Something like that." They watched Edward for a moment in comfortable silence. Finally, Eliza spoke, her voice soft. "Do you think we'll ever stop having to fight these battles?" John sighed, his expression thoughtful. "Probably not," he admitted. "But every fight brings us closer to something better, and as long as we keep pushing, change is inevitable." Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder. "Well, if anyone can make it happen, it's you." John smiled, his gaze steady. "It's us," he corrected. "We're in this together." As Edward's laughter filled the air, the weight of the past few days began to lift. The journey wasn't over, but they were ready for whatever came next. The ripple effects of the incident on Flight 237 continued to spread, transforming conversations about bias and accountability, not just within the airline, but across the aviation industry. News outlets reported on the airline's reforms, hailing it as a turning point for how companies address systemic issues. Other airlines announced similar reviews of their policies, spurred by the public pressure and the undeniable influence of John Anderson's actions. The Anderson family story became more than just a headline, it became a catalyst for change. Advocacy groups used the incident as a rallying cry, demanding better training and policies across customer service industries. The social media platforms buzzed with stories from passengers who had faced similar discrimination, their voices amplified by the spotlight on the airline's response. At home, John and Eliza watched the developments with cautious optimism. It wasn't about the attention or the accolades. It was about seeing real change take root. Their fight had never been about revenge. It had always been about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what they had. One afternoon, John received an email from the airline CEO. The subject line simply read, "Progress Report." Inside, the message detailed the initial results of the reforms. Mandatory training programs had been launched, with over 80% of employees completing the first phase. A third-party review had begun, and initial findings highlighted areas for further improvement. There was also a personal note from William Langston at the end. "Thank you for holding us accountable. Your insistence on doing what's right has made our company better, and we're not done yet." John forwarded the email to Eliza, adding his own note. Step 1, complete. On to step 2. Elsewhere, Evelyn sat in a small coffee shop, scrolling through job listings on her laptop. She had spent the week since her termination reflecting on what had happened. The regret was still raw, but she was determined not to let it define her. She had begun attending workshops on unconscious bias and diversity, hoping to better understand where she had gone wrong and how she could do better. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was a reply from the Anderson family, one she hadn't expected. "Miss Summers," it began. "Thank you for your apology. While we cannot undo what happened, we appreciate your acknowledgement of the harm caused. Growth begins with accountability, and we hope you continue to pursue it." Evelyn stared at the email, a lump forming in her throat. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step. She closed her laptop, her resolve strengthening. She couldn't change the past, but she could build a better future, one decision at a time. A month later, John found himself on another flight with his family. This time, the atmosphere was different. The staff greeted them warmly but without hesitation, their professionalism unwavering. As they settled into their seats in first class, Eliza looked at John with a small smile. "Do you think they know who you are?" she asked playfully. John chuckled, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter if they do. What matters is that they're treating everyone the way they should." As the plane taxied down the runway, Edward leaned over, holding up his toy airplane. "We flying again, Daddy?" he exclaimed, his face lighting up with excitement. "Yes, we are," John said, smiling at his son. He glanced at Eliza, her calm, radiant presence grounding him as always. This was what it was all for. Not power, not recognition, but the simple dignity of being treated fairly. As the plane lifted into the sky, John leaned back in his seat, watching the clouds drift past the window. He knew the work wasn't finished. There would always be more to fight for, more to improve. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that the journey they had started was already making a difference. And sometimes, he thought, that was enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.